What is the price of a kingdom? Is it paid in gold, in blood, or in faith? In the heart of Rome, a city built on legends and ruins, stands a state smaller than a city park, yet its influence spans the globe, the Vatican. And at its core, hidden from the eyes of the faithful, lies an institution that holds the answer. It is a bank that calls itself the Institute for the Works of Religion. But its true work has often been far from religious. In the Vatican's secret archives, a check for 1,750,000,000 lire can be found, a payment signed by Benito Mussolini himself just days before he would align his nation with the racist ideologies sweeping Europe. This was not a donation, it was the first installment, the down payment in a deal with the devil that would give birth to the world's most secretive and scandalous financial empire. This is the story of how faith was traded for fortune, how God's bank became a sanctuary for the world's darkest money, and how the pursuit of earthly power nearly destroyed a 2,000-year-old institution from within. The year was 1929. The world stood on the precipice of the Great Depression. In Italy, Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, was consolidating his fascist regime. He had power, he had the black shirts, but he lacked one crucial thing: legitimacy. He needed the blessing of the one power in Italy that still commanded the hearts of millions, the Catholic Church. For 60 years, the popes had been prisoners in the Vatican, refusing to recognize the Italian state that had seized their lands. Pope Pius XI, a shrewd and pragmatic leader, saw an opportunity. He was tired of the Church's poverty and political impotence. He dispatched his negotiators to meet with Mussolini's men in secret. The negotiations were tense, conducted in lavish Roman palaces under a veil of secrecy. Couriers with sealed briefcases scurried through the cobblestone streets, carrying drafts and counter-proposals. The stakes were astronomical. Finally, on February 11, 1929, the Lateran Pacts were signed. The Church recognized the Kingdom of Italy, and in return, Italy recognized the Vatican as a sovereign state. Mussolini had his victory. The Pope was no longer a prisoner, he was a king, but the most important part of the deal was not in the headlines. It was in the financial annex. Italy agreed to pay the Holy See a compensation of 750 million lire in cash and 1 billion lire in state bonds. It was an immense fortune, equivalent to billions of dollars today. This was the seed capital, this was the money that would create the Vatican Bank, but this money was tainted from the start, smelling of political compromise and the rising tide of fascism. The Vatican preached poverty from the pulpit, but practiced Wall Street in its cellars. It was a paradox that would come to define its existence. To manage this newfound wealth, Pope Pius XI needed a special kind of man, not a priest, but a financier. A man who understood the cold, hard logic of the market, a man unburdened by sentiment or even perhaps by faith. He found him in Bernardino Nogara. Nogara was a financial genius, a man who had managed fortunes for Italian nobility and international corporations. He was also a pragmatist to the point of cynicism. When he accepted the Pope's offer, he laid down one non-negotiable condition. He would not be constrained by Catholic doctrine in his investment decisions. He demanded the freedom to invest in any company, any industry, anywhere in the world, as long as it turned a profit. The Pope, desperate to secure the Church's financial future, agreed. Nogara's principle was simple and brutal: pecunia non olet. Money has no smell. Under his guidance, the Vatican's money flowed into a dizzying array of industries. It bought shares in companies that manufactured weapons, fueling the arms race that would soon engulf Europe. It invested in pharmaceutical firms that produced contraceptives, a direct violation of the Church's most sacred teachings. It speculated on the stock markets of London and New York, playing the same high-stakes games as the most ruthless capitalists. Nogara built a global empire, a diversified portfolio that insulated the Vatican from the economic storms of the era. He was brilliant, he was successful, and he laid the foundation for a culture of secrecy and moral compromise that would fester for decades. He created special holding companies in Switzerland and Luxembourg designed to obscure the Vatican's ownership and evade taxes. This was the birth of the offshore Vatican, a financial labyrinth accountable to no one but the Pope. The formal creation of the bank came a few years later, in 1942, in the darkest days of World War II. Pope Pius XII officially founded the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the Institute for the Works of Religion, or IOR. Its stated purpose was noble, to hold and manage assets intended for religious and charitable works. But its structure was anything but transparent. It was a bank with no public oversight, no regulators, no shareholders to answer to. Its only shareholder was the Pope. This absolute autonomy designed to protect the Church's assets from the predatory fascist regime would become its greatest curse. It created a financial black hole in the heart of Rome, a place where money could disappear without a trace. A place that would soon attract clients far more dangerous than Benito Mussolini. The money born of a pact with one form of fascism was about to be used in service of another for an even dirtier job, a job that involved saving not souls, but the very architects of genocide. What is more terrifying, a dictator who buys the Church's silence, or a church that uses his money to build a fortress of financial secrecy? You decide. The deal with Mussolini gave the Vatican its kingdom, but was it a kingdom of heaven or an empire of earthly power? Let us know your thoughts. A fortress for faith or a grab for power? The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, and the continent was haunted by the ghosts of the Holocaust. For most, it was a time of reckoning. But for thousands of Nazi war criminals and their collaborators, the war was not over. A new, desperate battle had begun, the race for survival. They had to escape, to vanish, to find new lives under new names. And to do that, they needed help. They needed a network, a clandestine organization with international reach, one that could provide false documents, safe houses, and passage to friendly shores. They found it in the unlikeliest of places. They found it in an organization that preached forgiveness and mercy. They found it in elements within the Catholic Church. This escape network would come to be known by a chillingly bureaucratic name, the ratlines. How did men like Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution, or Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Leon, manage to evade the Allied dragnet? How did they obtain passports, often from the International Red Cross, and secure tickets on ships bound for Argentina, Brazil, or Syria? The answer lies in a murky web of connections that stretched from the defeated Third Reich to the very heart of Rome. The investigation, pieced together over decades by determined journalists and historians, points to a network of sympathetic priests and bishops operating with at least the tacit knowledge of certain Vatican officials. Men like Bishop Alois Hudol, the rector of a German seminary in Rome, openly boasted of his efforts to help former Nazis. He saw them not as mass murderers, but as anti-communist warriors who deserved protection from what he called vengeance. Safe houses were established in monasteries and convents across Italy and Austria, providing shelter for men on the run. But this operation required more than just sympathy. It required money, cold, hard cash to bribe officials, pay for passage, and establish new lives. Where did this money come from? For years, survivors and investigators have pointed to the Vatican Bank. The allegation is as simple as it is horrific, that the IOR was used to hold and launder assets stolen by the Nazis and their allies, including gold plundered from the treasuries of conquered nations and, most disturbingly, gold ripped from the mouths of Holocaust victims. Proving this connection definitively has been nearly impossible. The bank's legendary secrecy, its off-the-books nature, has created a nearly impenetrable wall. The Vatican has always vehemently denied any institutional involvement, blaming the actions of a few rogue priests. Yet, declassified documents from the United States of America's intelligence agencies from the 1940s speak of large amounts of Nazi loot being funneled through Vatican channels. The story of the ratlines is a spy thriller played out in the chaos of post-war Europe. It's a story of men with hunted eyes being given new identities in quiet church offices, of whispered conversations in Roman cafes, of secret bank transfers that erased a bloody past. One former United States Army intelligence agent, William Gowan, who was tasked with investigating these networks, spoke of his immense frustration. Every time his investigation led towards the Vatican, he said, he hit a brick wall. The sovereignty of the Holy See, the very shield Bernardino Nogara had fought for, was now being used to protect not just the Church's assets, but also some of history's greatest monsters. For the Church, it seemed some souls were worth saving, while the stories of their millions of victims were simply worth forgetting. The moral stain of the ratlines would linger for decades. It created a perception of the Vatican as an entity that operated by its own rules, a state within a state that was above international law and common morality. It also reinforced the utility of the IOR as an instrument of covert policy. The bank was not just a place to grow money, it was a tool, a way to move funds discreetly to support causes the Church favored, or, in this case, to help individuals it wished to protect. This experience of using an opaque financial structure to achieve political ends would prove to be a powerful lesson. The gold allegedly laundered from the victims of the Second World War set a dark precedent. A new generation of criminals operating not under the swastika but under the banner of their own brutal codes of honor would learn this lesson well. They understood that the Vatican Bank was the perfect laundry, a place where money stained with blood could be washed clean, sanctified by its proximity to the divine. This new generation was rising from the ashes of Sicily, and they were about to make the Vatican an offer it couldn't refuse. The 1950s and 60s were a time of rebirth for Italy. It was the era of the miracolo economico, the economic miracle. Vespers zipped through the streets of Rome, Fellini was filming on the Via Veneto, and Italian industry was booming. But this miracle had a dark underbelly, a shadow economy fueled by crime and corruption. In the south, in Sicily, the Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian Mafia, was transforming itself from a rural band of thugs into a sophisticated international criminal enterprise. Their product was heroin. The so-called pizza connection was flooding the streets of the United States of America with narcotics, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in cash. This created a problem for the mafia, not a moral one, but a logistical one. What do you do with mountains of dirty lire and dollars? You can't just deposit them in a local bank. You need to launder them. You need to make them legitimate. The mafia needed a banker, a man with one foot in their world of violence and secrecy, and the other in the respectable world of high finance. They found their man in Michele Sindona. Sindona was a brilliant and ruthless Sicilian financier. He was charming, impeccably dressed, and moved with ease in the highest circles of power. He controlled a network of banks across Italy and Switzerland, and he had an audacious plan. He saw that the Vatican, with its sovereign status and its secret bank, was the ultimate money laundering machine. It was a sovereign entity that didn't have to answer to Italian tax authorities or bank regulators. It was the perfect black box. Sindona cultivated powerful friends within the Vatican, dazzling cardinals with his financial acumen and his devout Catholic facade. He became a trusted advisor to Pope Paul VI and was given sweeping control over many of the Vatican's foreign investments. With Sindona at the helm, the Vatican Bank entered its darkest chapter yet. It became the primary laundry for the Sicilian Mafia's heroin profits. The process was deceptively simple. Suitcases filled with cash from the streets of New York would be flown to Rome. The money would be deposited into anonymous numbered accounts at the IOR, accounts often held under the names of fictitious charities or religious orders. Once inside the Vatican's walls, the money was effectively clean. Sindona would then move the funds through his international network of shell companies and banks, investing it in legitimate businesses. Drug money from Palermo became real estate in Milan, or stocks in a multinational corporation. When the mafia prayed, they weren't asking for forgiveness, they were asking for a higher interest rate. The alliance was grotesquely symbiotic. The mafia got clean money and the veneer of respectability. The Vatican got a hefty commission on every transaction, and Sindona's Midas touch seemed to be making its own investments grow at an astonishing rate. The 1970s were the golden age of this unholy alliance. It was an era of unprecedented violence in Italy, the years of lead. Car bombs ripped through public squares, judges and journalists were assassinated in broad daylight. Much of this violence was orchestrated by the Mafia, which was fighting a brutal war against the state. And this war was being financed in part through the Vatican. The money of murderers and drug traffickers was flowing through the accounts of the Institute for the Works of Religion. But empires built on crime are inherently unstable. Sindona's was no exception. He grew reckless. In 1972, he bought a controlling interest in the Franklin National Bank in the United States, one of the country's largest. He used it for fraudulent currency speculation and to continue his money laundering operations. But his luck ran out. By 1974, the Franklin National Bank collapsed in what was then the largest bank failure in American history. The collapse of the Franklin sent shockwaves through the international financial system. Investigators in both Italy and the United States began to unravel Sindona's complex web of fraud. He was now a wanted man. He fled, staged a fake kidnapping, and tried to blackmail his former political protectors. But his time was up. The Mafia, fearing he would talk, turned on him. So did his powerful friends. In 1986, while serving a life sentence in an Italian prison, Michel Sindona drank a cup of coffee laced with cyanide. His death was officially ruled a suicide, but few believe it. He was silenced, but he had not acted alone. He was part of a much larger, more sinister network, a secret brotherhood that had its own rituals, its own agenda, and its own plans for the future of Italy. Sindona was their banker, but he was just one piece in a much more dangerous game. A game whose players included generals, spies, and government ministers, all bound by a secret oath to an organization known as Propaganda Due. In March of 1981, Italian investigators were looking into Michele Sindona's fraudulent activities. A lead took them to the villa of a man named Licio Gelli in Arezzo, Tuscany. Gelli was a smooth, well-connected businessman with a shadowy fascist past. The police expected to find financial documents. They found something far more explosive. They found a list. It contained 962 names. It was a roster of the most powerful people in Italy. There were cabinet ministers, members of parliament, the heads of all three of Italy's intelligence agencies, dozens of senior military officers, top industrialists, and prominent journalists. And on that list were the names of men who managed the Vatican's money. This was the membership roll of a secret Masonic lodge called Propaganda Due, or P2. It was, in effect, a shadow government, a state within the state, with its tentacles reaching into every corner of Italian life. And at the heart of its financial operations was the Vatican Bank. The puppet master of this conspiracy was Licio Gelli, the Grand Master of the P2 Lodge. He was a master of intrigue, a man who thrived in the world of secrets and shadows. His goal was nothing less than to subvert Italian democracy and install an authoritarian right-wing regime. To do this, he needed money and influence. The lodge provided the influence, a network of powerful men loyal to him. The money came from a variety of sources, but a key financial artery ran through a bank in Milan called Banco Ambrosiano, and the largest single shareholder of Banco Ambrosiano was the Vatican Bank, the IOR. The man who ran Banco Ambrosiano, the man who connected all these worlds, the Vatican, the Masons, and high finance, was Roberto Calvi. Calvi was known as God's banker because of his close ties to the Holy See. He was also a member of Licio Gelli's P2 Lodge. Under Calvi's direction, and with the partnership of the IOR, Banco Ambrosiano became the financial engine of the P2 conspiracy. The mechanism was a network of shell companies based in Panama, Luxembourg, and other offshore havens. The Vatican Bank provided letters of comfort, essentially guarantees, for massive loans made by Banco Ambrosiano to these phantom corporations. The money, over $1.3 billion, simply vanished. It was used to manipulate the stock market, to illegally buy control of major corporations, and to finance the P2's political operations. This included funding for right-wing terrorist groups responsible for bombings and assassinations, part of a strategy of tension designed to create chaos and justify a military takeover. In Rome, it was said there were two popes, one in a white cassock and one in a black Masonic apron. The Vatican was no longer just laundering money for the mafia, it was now financing a plot to overthrow a democratic government. Could you keep a secret that could destroy the faith of millions? The men inside the Vatican walls were faced with this very question. The head of the IOR at the time was Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, a tough, charismatic American from Cicero, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago famous as Al Capone's old stomping ground. Marcinkus was a man who famously quipped, "You can't run the church on Hail Marys." He worked closely with Calvi and Sindona. He was the Vatican's link in this chain of corruption. When the P2 list was discovered, the entire conspiracy began to unravel. Investigators started following the money trail from Banco Ambrosiano. It led directly to the shell companies, to Calvi, and inevitably to the Vatican Bank and to Marcinkus himself. The house of cards was collapsing. The players, once so powerful, were now exposed and vulnerable. They had become liabilities. And in the world they inhabited, liabilities had a way of being permanently erased. The system needed to cleanse itself. The year 1978 would mark the beginning of a bloody reckoning, a series of deaths so strange and convenient that they still fuel speculation to this day. Who holds the real power in a nation? Is it the elected officials who operate in the light, or the secret societies that manipulate events from the shadows? It's your call. Do you trust the sovereign state, or do you fear the secret society? The summer of 1978 was hot and tense in Rome. In August, Pope Paul VI, the pontiff who had overseen the Vatican's deep entanglement with Sindona and Calvi, died. The conclave elected a surprise candidate, Cardinal Albino Luciani of Venice. He took the name John Paul I. He was known as the Smiling Pope, a man of genuine humility and pastoral warmth. He was also deeply disturbed by the financial scandals that were beginning to surface. From the moment he took the throne, he made it clear that he intended to clean house. He launched an investigation into the Vatican Bank. He spoke of transferring Archbishop Marcinkus to a new post far from Rome. He requested a list of all the Vatican officials who were rumored to be Freemasons, a practice forbidden by the Church. He was preparing to sever the Vatican's ties with Calvi's Banco Ambrosiano. He was a threat to the entire system. On the morning of September 29, 1978, after just 33 days in office, Pope John Paul I was found dead in his bed. He was 65 years old. The Vatican announced that he had died of a heart attack. The announcement was rushed and the details were contradictory. They claimed a priest found him when it was a nun. They said he was reading a religious text, but his glasses and papers were nowhere to be found. Crucially, no autopsy was performed, a violation of Italian law, which the Vatican sidestepped by citing its own sovereignty. The official story was that he had a weak heart, but many inside and outside the Vatican believed he was murdered, poisoned, silenced before he could expose the rot at the heart of the Holy See. The men he planned to remove, Marcinkus, and others connected to the P2 network, remained in their positions of power. His death was a message. The scandal, however, could not be contained. With the P2 conspiracy now public knowledge, Italian investigators closed in on Roberto Calvi. By 1981, Banco Ambrosiano was on the verge of collapse, crushed by the weight of the $1.3 billion that had vanished into the P2 accounts. Calvi was arrested, convicted of currency violations, and sentenced to prison, but he managed to get out on appeal. He knew that his former partners, the Mafia, the Masons, and perhaps even figures within the Vatican saw him as the single greatest threat. He held all the secrets. He knew where the money went. In early June of 1982, he fled Italy on a false passport. He flew to London, a city where he believed he had powerful friends. He was wrong. On the morning of June 18, 1982, a postal worker crossing Blackfriars Bridge in London looked down and saw a body hanging from the scaffolding beneath the arch. It was Roberto Calvi. His pockets were stuffed with over $15,000 in various currencies and, bizarrely, with bricks and rock. The scene was grotesque and deeply symbolic. Blackfriars Bridge was named for a monastic order. The members of the P2 Lodge referred to themselves as Frati Neri, or Black Friars. The first coroner's verdict was suicide, but no one believed it. His family fought for years to have the case reopened. A second inquest returned an open verdict. Finally, in 2002, forensic experts hired by Italian prosecutors concluded that Calvi was murdered. He was too heavy with the rocks in his pockets to have climbed over the railing and hanged himself. He was killed elsewhere and staged to look like a suicide, a ritual Masonic execution. For God's bankers, the final judgment came not from heaven but from a rope and a bridge. The chain of convenient deaths, Sindona, John Paul I, Calvi, was complete. The key witnesses were silenced. But the scandal was now a global firestorm. A new pope, John Paul II, inherited a throne stained with blood and ink. And at the center of the storm, seemingly untouchable, stood one man, the American Archbishop from Cicero, Paul Marcinkus. The murder of Roberto Calvi under a London bridge and the spectacular collapse of Banco Ambrosiano created a crisis of epic proportions for the Vatican. The world's press descended on Rome, and the story was on the front page of every newspaper. It was a sordid tale of high finance, Masonic conspiracies and murder, all leading back to the Pope's own bank. The newly elected Pope John Paul II, a charismatic Polish pontiff known for his fierce anti-communism, now faced a battle for the very soul of his church. He had to act. The stench of corruption was overwhelming the scent of incense. But how do you clean a house that is built on secrets? How do you reform a system that is designed to be untouchable? His first and most difficult problem was Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. Marcinkus, the head of the IOR, was at the heart of the scandal. Italian magistrates issued a warrant for his arrest in 1987, accusing him of being an accessory to fraudulent bankruptcy in the Ambrosiano collapse. They believed he knew exactly where the $1 billion had gone. But Marcinkus never faced a courtroom. He simply retreated behind the bronze doors and high walls of the Vatican. The Holy See invoked its sovereign status, arguing that as a Vatican official, Marcinkus had diplomatic immunity. For years, he lived as a fugitive from Italian justice, just a few hundred yards from the courthouse that wanted to prosecute him. He became a symbol of the Vatican's arrogance and impunity, a living testament to the wall of silence that protected the Church's darkest secrets. He continued to run the bank, playing tennis on the Vatican courts, seemingly unbothered by the international manhunt. Pope John Paul II was in an impossible position. He needed to restore the Church's moral authority, but he also needed to protect its sovereignty, the very principle that was shielding Marcinkus. His solution was a classic Vatican compromise. The Holy See never admitted any legal responsibility for the Banco Ambrosiano collapse. They insisted the letters of comfort Marcinkus had provided were not legally binding guarantees. However, as a goodwill gesture, the Vatican agreed to pay over $240 million to the creditors of the failed bank. It was a staggering sum, an implicit admission of guilt wrapped in the language of charity. The money trail showed the payment came from a series of accounts at the IOR, a quiet acknowledgement of where the responsibility lay. But no one went to jail. No senior Vatican official was ever punished. Marcinkus was eventually allowed to retire peacefully in Sun City, Arizona, where he lived until his death in 2006, taking his secrets with him. The episode was a masterclass in how the Vatican system protects itself. It absorbs scandals, contains the damage, pays when it must, but never, ever allows outsiders to breach its walls. It sacrifices money to protect its men and its sovereignty. For John Paul II, the affair was a deep and lasting wound. He tried to implement reforms. He appointed a commission of cardinals to oversee the IOR and brought in outside financial experts. He issued new statutes designed to bring a measure of transparency to the bank's operations. But the fundamental structure remained the same. The IOR was still a bank unlike any other, accountable only to the Pope, a sovereign entity operating within another sovereign state, a perfect vehicle for secrecy and intrigue. He had fought the battle against the system, but the system had, in many ways, won. It had bent, but it had not broken. The old guard remained, the culture of secrecy was deeply ingrained, and the lesson was learned. Scandals pass, but the bank endures. For a time, the storm subsided, but the seeds of the next crisis were already being sown. The 21st century would bring new technologies and new challenges, but it would reveal the same old sins. The age of hackers and leakers was coming, and the Vatican's ancient walls were about to be breached in a way no one had ever imagined. For 2 decades after the Calvi affair, the Vatican Bank managed to stay out of the headlines. The world moved on. The Cold War ended, the internet was born, and the financial scandals of the 1980s seemed like a distant memory. The reforms of John Paul II had created a facade of normality, but beneath the surface, the old culture of secrecy and illicit finance continued to thrive. The IOR remained a tempting destination for those who wished to hide their money from tax authorities and law enforcement. A new generation of corrupt Italian politicians and businessmen found their way to its discreet tellers. The system hadn't been cleansed, it had just learned to be more careful. But in the modern world, secrets are harder to keep. The fortress of the Vatican was about to be besieged not by an army, but by a leak. The year was 2012. The scandal that erupted was not called Ambrosiano, but Vatileaks. It began when an Italian journalist published a book filled with explosive, top-secret documents taken from the Pope's own desk. The source was a man of unprecedented access, Paolo Gabriele, Pope Benedict XVI's personal butler. Motivated, he claimed, by a desire to expose the evil and corruption within the Church, Gabriele had spent years photocopying sensitive letters, memos, and financial reports. He leaked a trove of documents that painted a devastating picture of the modern Vatican. They revealed bitter power struggles between cardinals, allegations of corruption in the awarding of Vatican contracts, and once again, evidence of financial malpractice at the IOR. The documents showed that the bank was still being used for money laundering and tax evasion, despite all the promises of reform. It was a case of déjà vu, a depressing reminder that the institutional sickness had never been cured. The Vatileaks scandal threw the papacy of Benedict XVI into turmoil. He was a theologian, a scholar, a man ill-suited to the brutal infighting of the Vatican court. The betrayal by his own butler was a deep personal blow. The revelations of ongoing financial crime were a public humiliation. For years, the Vatican had been struggling to comply with international anti-money laundering regulations. The Bank of Italy and other European regulators were putting immense pressure on the Holy See to become more transparent. The Vatileaks documents showed just how fierce the internal resistance to these reforms was. They described a war between a faction of reformers trying to bring the Vatican into the modern financial world and an old guard determined to protect the profitable secrecy of the past. The scandal was a confirmation that the IOR was still a rogue institution, a law unto itself. What is the greater sin, the one committed in the heat of passion, or the one committed coldly year after year in the quiet of an accounting ledger? On February 11, 2013, in a move that stunned the world, Pope Benedict XVI announced his resignation. Citing his advanced age and failing health, he became the first pope to voluntarily step down in nearly 600 years. The official reason was his health. But many Vatican observers believe the relentless tide of scandal culminating in Vatileaks was the final straw. He was a man who had looked into the abyss of the Church's own dysfunction and realized he lacked the strength or the will to fight the beasts that stared back. His resignation was a tacit admission of defeat. He could not tame the hydra that was coiled in the heart of the institution he led. He had tried to steer the ship of St. Peter through stormy seas, but he found it was being steered by other invisible hands. The system had once again proven more powerful than the man at its head. The question of what to do about the bank, this source of cyclical scandal and shame, would now fall to his successor. And his successor would be a man unlike any the Vatican had ever seen before, Did the butler who leaked the documents commit an act of unforgivable disloyalty, or did he risk his freedom to expose a necessary truth? Let the world know your view. Or was it an act of betrayal or a fight for truth? The conclave of 2013 gathered under a cloud of crisis. The Church was reeling from the Vatican scandal and the shock of a papal resignation. The cardinals needed a leader who could restore trust, a man who could finally and decisively confront the corruption that had plagued the Vatican for so long. They chose a man from the ends of the earth, Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio of Argentina. He was the first pope from the Americas, the first Jesuit pope, and he took the name Francis in honor of the saint of poverty and reform. From the moment he appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, it was clear this was a different kind of pope. He shunned the ornate papal apartments for a simple guest house, he wore a plain iron cross instead of a gold one, and he spoke in the language of the poor and the marginalized. He was the pope from the slums, and he was about to declare war on the princes of the Church. For Pope Francis, the reform of the Vatican Bank was not just a matter of financial housekeeping, it was a moral and spiritual imperative. He famously called the IOR necessary, but only up to a point. His message was clear: the bank must either serve the true mission of the Church or be shut down entirely. He launched what can only be described as a revolution. He appointed a special commission of international experts to conduct a top-to-bottom review of the IOR. He brought in Ernst & Young, one of the world's top accounting firms, to audit the Vatican's labyrinthine finances, an unprecedented move that horrified the old guard, who had guarded their books like sacred texts. He hired a new director for the bank, a man with a background in international finance, and gave him a mandate to clean it up, no matter who was implicated. The results were swift and dramatic. Thousands of accounts at the IOR were closed. These were accounts that did not belong to clergy, religious orders, or Vatican employees, the bank's intended clientele. They were suspicious accounts held by politicians, businessmen, and others who had no legitimate reason to be banking inside the Vatican. It was a systematic draining of the swamp. For the first time in its history, the IOR began to publish an annual report, a small step towards transparency that was nonetheless revolutionary for the secretive institution. Francis also created a new super-ministry, the Secretariat for the Economy, headed by the tough-talking Australian Cardinal George Pell, to oversee all of the Vatican's financial activities. Power was being stripped from the old Italian-dominated Curia and placed in the hands of professional, international lay experts and reformers. But this revolution was not without resistance. Every step Francis took was met with fierce opposition from within the Vatican. There was bureaucratic obstruction, leaks to the Italian press designed to discredit the reformers, and a whispering campaign against the Pope himself. The old guard, the network of powerful cardinals and officials who had profited from the old system of secrecy and patronage, fought back with every tool at their disposal. The climax of this struggle came with the unprecedented criminal trial of Cardinal Angelo Becciu, once one of the most powerful men in the Vatican. In 2021, Becciu was put on trial in a Vatican court, accused of embezzlement and abuse of office related to a disastrous London real estate deal. A prince of the Church being tried by his own institution was an unthinkable event, a clear signal from Francis that no one was above the law. The struggle is far from over. Cleaning up an institution with a decades-long history of corruption is not the work of a single pontificate. But Pope Francis has fundamentally changed the game. He has ripped away the veil of secrecy, exposed the institution to outside scrutiny, and shown a willingness to prosecute even the highest-ranking officials. He has fought to transform the Vatican Bank from a source of scandal into an instrument of service. His battle is a reminder that the greatest enemies of the Church are often not outside its walls, but within its own corridors of power. But the influence of the bank has never been confined to those corridors. For decades, its money, like an invisible current, has flowed out into the wider world, shaping politics, toppling governments, and playing a secret role in the great geopolitical struggles of the 20th century. The story of the Vatican Bank is not just a tale of internal corruption, it is a story of global power. The money held within its vaults has never been neutral. It has been a weapon, a tool, an instrument of geopolitical influence wielded by the Holy See in the great ideological battles of the modern era. The bank's unique status, a sovereign offshore financial entity with global reach and almost perfect secrecy, made it an ideal partner for the clandestine operations of the Cold War. It was a silent player in a world of spies and secret agents, a place where the interests of God and the Central Intelligence Agency sometimes conveniently aligned. Its money flowed across the Iron Curtain and into the jungles of Latin America, a hidden force shaping the fate of nations. One of the most significant and well-documented of these covert operations was the financing of the Solidarity movement in Poland. In the 1980s, Pope John Paul II, himself a Pole who had lived under communist rule, saw a historic opportunity to destabilize the Soviet Empire from within. He threw the full weight of the Catholic Church behind Lech Wałęsa's independent trade union. But movements need more than moral support. They need cash. The United States of America, under President Ronald Reagan, was eager to support Solidarity as well. A secret alliance was formed. According to investigative journalists like Carl Bernstein, the Central Intelligence Agency would funnel funds through the Vatican Bank. The IOR would then move the money through its own channels into Poland, where it was distributed to Solidarity activists to pay for printing presses, radio equipment, and other tools of resistance. It was one of the most successful covert operations of the Cold War, and the Vatican Bank was its financial heart. But the bank's geopolitical activities had a much darker side. While it was supporting a movement for democracy in Poland, it was also allegedly channeling funds to support brutal, right-wing military dictatorships in Latin America. In countries like Argentina and Chile, the church hierarchy was often deeply conservative and fiercely anti-communist. The Vatican saw the military juntas, despite their horrific human rights records, as a bulwark against the spread of atheistic Marxism. There is evidence to suggest that funds from the IOR and other Catholic organizations were used to prop up these regimes, to support their intelligence services, and to counter the influence of liberation theology, a popular movement among priests and nuns who sided with the poor and oppressed. The Church was playing both sides of the street, supporting freedom in one part of the world while enabling repression in another, all under the unifying banner of anti-communism. This is the great paradox of the Vatican's role in world affairs. It is a spiritual power that wields immense temporal influence. The IOR allowed the papacy to act as a shadow superpower, with its own secret budget and its own foreign policy, often operating in parallel with, or even in opposition to, the official diplomacy of nation-states. It could move money across borders with a freedom that no other government or intelligence agency could match. This gave it enormous leverage. But it also entangled the Church in the dirty, morally compromising business of espionage and covert action. Decisions made in a quiet office inside the Vatican walls had life and death consequences for people thousands of miles away, from the shipyards of Gdansk to the torture chambers of Santiago. The bank's secrets were not just about financial fraud, they were about coups and revolutions, about the hidden history of the modern world. And this leads to the ultimate question, the final, unsettling secret that the walls of the Vatican still hide. After decades of scandals, murders, reforms, and renewed scandals, what is the final secret of the Vatican Bank? Is there a single, explosive truth hidden in a dusty ledger, a forgotten account number that explains everything? Perhaps not. Perhaps the ultimate secret is not a fact to be uncovered, but a truth to be understood. The history of the Institute for the Works of Religion is a relentless cycle of sin and repentance. It is a story that proves that when absolute faith is combined with absolute money, the result is absolute secrecy. And within that secrecy, the darkest aspects of human nature are free to flourish. The bank was created to protect the Church, to give it the financial independence to pursue its divine mission. But that very independence, that sovereign shield, made it an irresistible magnet for the world's dirtiest money and most corrupt forces. Is the bank a cancerous tumor on the body of the church, a demonic entity that must be excised, as some reformers have argued? Or is it a necessary evil, the dark, beating heart that pumps the blood money required to fund the Vatican's global mission, its charities, its diplomacy, its very existence, as the cynics and pragmatists might counter? The story provides no easy answer. It shows us popes who tried to reform it and were defeated, either by death or by the sheer weight of the system. It shows us reformers who fought bravely only to see the old habits return the moment their vigilance waned. It seems that any attempt to use the bank for the good of the church inevitably unleashes uncontrollable, destructive forces. Anyone who enters its orbit, a pope, a banker, an investigator, is drawn into a vortex of moral compromise, risking their reputation, their freedom, or their very life. The final secret of the Vatican Bank, then, may not be about the mafia's gold or the Central Intelligence Agency's covert funds. The final secret is the tacit, terrifying acknowledgement of a Faustian bargain. It is the realization that to wield power on earth, to operate as a kingdom of this world, an institution, even one that claims to represent the kingdom of heaven, must sometimes make deals with hell. The bank's history is a long cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the near impossibility of serving both God and mammon. The walls of the Vatican were built to protect the faith, but they also served to hide the sins of the faithful. The question that remains, echoing through the marble halls of St. Peter's and the silent vaults of its bank, is not whether the institution can ever be truly cleansed, but whether it was ever meant to be. The ultimate mystery is not what the accounts contain, but whether an institution can touch the filth of the world and not become stained itself. Could it be that the bank is not a perversion of the Church's mission, but its truest, most honest reflection, a mirror showing the eternal, tragic conflict between the sacred and the profane?